Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Toya Delgado, a young woman of 30 years, was sitting in a technical storage room by an open window. She was gazing at tall trees that were like candles in a small square adjoining the backside of the Registro Civil building, where she worked as a janitor. In front of her was a cup of cold coffee, some crumbled cookies in a bowl, and a little time to catch her breath. She watched the sprawling white-trunked trees rustle with autumn's yellow leaves. The weather had been like this for a week already, with warm late summer days. Nature offered solace. Toya immersed herself in the honeyed silence, and slowly, unbidden memories crept into her thoughts. It had been 7 years since Pablo's death. Yes, it happened that way. She became a widow early, leaving behind 3-year-old twins, Manuela and Celso. How had Toya lived all these years? In various ways. She had to bid farewell to the grand plans she and her husband had made before that dreadful tragedy. Toya quit her job since she couldn't juggle taking care of young children and fulfilling her work duties with excellence. Her boss, after participating in her life as much as most bosses do, demanded high-quality work and had no tolerance for sick leaves or requests like, "Can I leave early today?" Finding a nanny for 2 infants simultaneously proved impossible. Toya eventually abandoned the idea because money was always in short supply. Toya had no parents. She had never known her father, never seen him, and heard nothing about him since her earliest childhood. Her mother passed away when Toya turned 12. Her mother's departure was quite strange. She succumbed to untreated double pneumonia. Later, of course, Toya learned the details of her mother's death, but at that time, the girl didn't grasp everything happening in her family. The social services then sent Toya to an orphanage until her grandmother, Dorotea, assumed guardianship over her. The orphanage was located outside the city, in a wooded area near a narrow river. Life was comfortable there for Toya, contrary to the horrifying tales about orphanages and caregivers. This one was a fairly decent institution where children were treated humanely, regardless of how they ended up there, whether they were abandoned as infants, lost their parents tragically, or their parents were still alive but had hit rock bottom in life, or for whatever other reason. In the orphanage, Toya befriended Julia Cano, her peer, whose parents had perished in a helicopter crash during an aerial excursion over African jungles. Julia often recalled their family's wealth, their enormous house, and their travels to different countries. But when her parents were no more, none of her well-off relatives, close or distant, took responsibility for the little girl's fate. Since then, she has lived in the orphanage, replacing her home hearth. The girls were drawn to each other, and they formed a strong friendship despite the fact that they differed a lot. Julia was lively, cheerful, and resilient, always finding a way out of any situation, while Toya, on the contrary, was calm, reserved, and composed, not expressing emotions in the presence of strangers. Perhaps the one thing that united them was a very strong inner strength. And life constantly reaffirmed this truth. The two women remained friends forever. Julia played a significant role in ensuring that Toya didn't lose herself after her grandmother's death and, later, her husband's passing. She prevented Toya from falling into irreversible depression or, worse, from ending her difficult life. Living with her grandmother was good. Dorotea gladly took on the upbringing of her orphan granddaughter, and Toya, in turn, didn't cause her grandmother any significant trouble. Everything worked out for them: Toya's school education, household chores, her extracurricular activities in the Young Constructors Club, and her college years. Then came the timely bread-breaking gatherings with her future son-in-law, for which Dorotea prepared her signature yeast pies. And a modest but dignified wedding when Dorotea gave her only beloved granddaughter to Pablo, taking his noble and honest word regarding Toya's future. Dorotea lived in a 2-room apartment in an old building. Despite its small size, the apartment felt spacious due to its high, nearly 3-meter ceilings. Toya settled into this new home, loving it dearly. She was confident that amidst all life's trials, she could find shelter and salvation here, within these sturdy and dependable walls. But happiness is not eternal. Sooner or later, it yields to the next wave of hardships. Her beloved grandmother passed away shortly after Toya's wedding. She hadn't been sick, as is typical with elderly people. Although she suffered from hypertension, she always conscientiously monitored her blood pressure. Perhaps Toya was unaware of some health issue her grandmother had. Nonetheless, Dorothea departed peacefully, and suddenly she had a heart attack. Toya struggled to accept that her dear grandmother was no longer with her. However, optimist Julia was constantly by her side, offering unwavering support. There was also her beloved Pablo, and later, the little boys, so endearing and funny, so dear, that grief slowly receded into the background, settling on a more distant shelf of memory, making way for challenging yet pleasant family responsibilities. The young parents and their children moved from the factory dormitory into the grandmother's apartment, embarking on a new, brighter chapter of their lives. Toya sometimes couldn't believe her luck. She thought, perhaps there is a God after all. And finally, he granted her joyful days after enduring all the tribulations that had befallen her orphaned life. Pablo and Toya met at work. One day, striking up a conversation in the cafeteria during lunch, they discovered that, coincidentally, Pablo had also grown up in an orphanage, just like Toya. It was an incredible twist of fate, although his experience of being an orphan had been even harsher. His parents had abandoned him right after his birth. Throughout his childhood, Pablo harbored the burning desire to find his biological parents when he grew up. He relentlessly pursued targeted searches, which ultimately revealed that almost nothing was known about the people who brought him into the world. Did they even exist in this world? Perhaps he miraculously fell from the heavens onto this troubled earth. Thus began Toya and Pablo's close acquaintance, which blossomed into deep affection. They genuinely loved each other, he loved her, and she loved him, and they couldn't imagine life without each other. Deprived of parents, these young people made concerted efforts to create a real family where everyone loved and respected each other. Pablo and Toya were engineers at the machine manufacturing plant. Pablo was making good progress in his career. He had already gained a reputation as a promising designer, and various colleagues looked at him in different ways. A couple of coworkers openly envied him, while a few others did so secretly. In a workplace where women engineers were not common, some of the female colleagues flirted with subtle hints, and the managers had big plans for him. Like any workplace, there were office intrigues, but there were also plenty of friendly relationships. In general, Toya and Pablo could be considered successful individuals and a happy couple. 2 years later, Pablo took out a loan to buy his own car, and the next item on the agenda was improving their living conditions. It was time for the children to enter daycare, but all 4 of them eagerly wished for a new addition to the family. However, life doesn't always go according to plan. Life is unpredictable. People make their assumptions, but it's ultimately in God's hands. Everything crashed down in an instant when, one fateful day, while answering her mobile phone, Toya heard an unfamiliar baritone voice on the other end. "Toya Delgado?" The stranger's stern formality startled Toya, and she replied with tension. "Yes, it's me. Sergio Santos, from the police." "Hello. Who is Pablo Delgado to you?" Her heart felt like it had been pierced from the left side, causing immense pain. "He's my husband." "What happened? What's wrong with Pablo?" She cried out. "Could you come to the following address?" Pablo was involved in a car accident. Everything blurred before her eyes, and her head seemed to plunge into an unknown abyss. In the distance, the twins' cries echoed through the air. One began to sob, sensing the looming sorrow, and the other joined in, creating an unstoppable chorus of grief. "Yes, I'll be there soon," Toya whispered. She collapsed on the sofa in helplessness, but in her mind, the thought persisted, "I need to get up, I need to go." In the square, there were brides and grooms, guests with flowers, festive speeches could be heard, and cheerful voices filled the air. Toya came to her senses. She gazed at the brides in their long, white dresses with a mixture of admiration and a hint of harmless envy, observing like someone who had lived on this fragile earth for far too long and thus knew everything about life. Then, putting on her rubber gloves and grabbing a bucket, she entered her storage room and set off for her next assignment. Besides her part-time work online, Toya worked as a janitor at Registro Civil, taking on any opportunity to earn money. By the way, Julia had helped Toya secure the job at Registro Civil, as Julia had connections there. The manager was an acquaintance of Julia's parents' friends. That's how it happened. When the woman learned the story of the poor orphan, she decided to help her. At that time, Julia was 19. Julia received a one-bedroom apartment from the government. The manager, without much talk, got involved in the young woman's life, renovated her housing, and, after Julia finished college, helped her find a job. She skillfully and subtly, without intruding into Julia's personal matters, kept an eye on her and guided her in the right direction. While washing the floors in the offices, Toya once again surrendered to her memories. Today, for some reason, they stubbornly invaded her soul without asking for permission, and Toya didn't try to push them away. Toya had buried her beloved husband, or rather, what remained of him after that terrible accident. The coffin was closed. She had no chance to kiss his cold forehead. She couldn't farewell properly. They hadn't shown her the disfigured and charred Pablo at the morgue. Instead, they had brought out his personal belongings for identification: the mangled watch with a piece of the bracelet and the miraculously preserved, tattered half of a boot, which likely got blown off in the explosive blast. When Toya saw Pablo's half boot, she couldn't bear it and fell into a faint. Nausea crept up her throat, a darkness engulfed her vision, and she couldn't remember anything more. She woke up in the corridor on a wooden bench, and the first thing that appeared before her was the gentle face of Grandma Dorotea. Smiling softly, her grandmother said, "Toya, it's still too early. Get up, my little one, we have to go." The face began to blur, disperse, and suddenly vanish, as if it dissolved into space. The attendants helped her get up from the bench. A heavy question hammered at her head: why? Why did this happen to her? What is this? The price for short-lived happiness, another trial? Hasn't God had enough of testing her? "Toya, dear, we need to go," they told her. But this wasn't her grandmother, it was her devoted friend Julia, who accompanied her to the grave and back, trying to get her away from the cemetery as soon as possible. However, Toya's legs turned to jelly, she couldn't feel them. It turned out that Toya had stood next to the mound of earth, covered with mourning wreaths and flowers, in a daze, devastated, staring at one point without moving. "Toya," Julia began, imploringly, "please, let's go. The children are waiting at home." And that's when Toya broke down. She dropped her head on her friend's shoulder and sobbed loudly, desperately wailing. "Why is this happening to me? Why? For what reason? What have I done to God?" After the funeral, everything spun around without respite or end. The main hardship that tormented her was the lack of money. They had to sell the car, along with a few meager valuables, just to make ends meet until Toya could find suitable work. Fortunately, they managed to secure 2 spots for the children in a daycare, providing some physical relief. Manuela adapted to it calmly, but Celso cried like crazy for almost 2 months. One day, he finally stopped, realizing that either Mom or Aunt Julia would come to take him home anyway. However, Celso didn't fully accept the daycare until he graduated from the preschool group. Every morning, he protested loudly to his mother. Toya sighed as she finished cleaning Caterina's office, the head of the Registro Civil. Caterina Morales was too strict, categorical, and demanding when it came to her subordinate staff. Opening the door from the office into the corridor, Toya unexpectedly bumped into Julia. "Julia, I almost ran into you. Why are you running around the Registro Civil? Are you crazy?" Julia, ignoring the snarky remarks, abruptly grabbed her friend's hand. "Is Caterina in her office?" "No. Go back in. I've got some exciting news." The woman dove into the head's office and plopped down on the soft couch across from her desk. "So, crazy lady, spill the beans. What's going on with you? Are you about to give birth or something?" "No. Antonio is enough for me. These are for you, Toya. Julia glanced conspiratorially at her friend. Do you happen to know that Chita is resigning? Chita Bravo, originally a lawyer by profession, was considered one of the leading experts at the Registro Civil and a pro at this work. But most importantly, Chita was the only one who conducted the solemn registrations of marriages, births, and any kind of celebration at the institution. Katerina wouldn't entrust this facade mission to just anyone. Toya looked surprised and smirked. So what? Do you also happen to know the reason she's leaving? You always seem to be in the know about everything in the world. It's a wonder. Julia shook her head reproachfully, as if saying, what an ungrateful friend. I tell her everything, and she still complains. Of course, I know. She's going to the big city to be with her son. Something happened with his daughter there. Well, Toya prodded. You're so dense. Don't you catch it at all? No, Toya shrugged. Well, a position is opening up, that's what. Don't miss your chance, silly. Julia even coughed at the effort. I'll talk to Katerina if you don't want to. You're a creative person, talented, well-educated, and articulate. Remember how great you were at performing in the orphanage's morning shows? With a little practice, you'll be a superb host, the best one can find. And besides, Toya, you're a real beauty, not like the underachiever Chita. Look at what you've become over these years. We'll get you in shape, and you'll start a new life. Toya shuddered. A new life. She had enough of that, with all its contents. She didn't need anything more. Oh, come on, Julia. Me, a host? Yep, I knew it. Here we go. Are you planning to scrub floors for the rest of your life? Julia mechanically unzipped her purse, took out her compact mirror, and after a second, she threw it back in without opening it. Why for the rest of my life? It's already getting easier. I'll probably return to the factory or find a job at a construction company. I thought maybe I could get into management. Find a job, for example, at a car dealership. They're always in need of managers. Exactly, but you won't make a good manager. In a dealership, you have to spin sales like a squirrel on a wheel, otherwise, you won't make a dime. It's not for everyone, Toya. You'll just end up suffering again. Julia, it seems like you've set a goal to live my life for me. Julia pretended not to hear Toya's words and, frowning, summed up. All right. I get it. I'm waiting for Katerina. Tomorrow, you'll take up the position. Toya remained silent, smiling wistfully, but in her eyes, there seemed to be a mix of either anxiety or some kind of sadness. A new kind of sadness, not for her deceased husband, not for the established order of things, but for something else, maybe even for herself. She felt like she had hit a dead end. Moreover, lately, amidst the backdrop of established natural beauty, she had been haunted by strange premonitions. Something was about to happen, some changes were approaching her fate again. She began to fear something was looming. However, she hadn't shared these suspicious feelings with Julia yet, but her practical friend didn't miss a thing. During their conversation, Julia keenly sensed Toya's mood. Taking advantage of a pause, she changed her tone and asked calmly and cautiously, Toya, are you okay? Is something happening? Am I missing something? Toya looked at her friend, who was almost like a sister in a friendly way. I wanted to tell you, I was even thinking of inviting myself over, and you suddenly showed up as if you heard me. Julia raised her eyebrows and froze in anxious anticipation. Oh, God, what now? Don't worry. Everything's fine. But, you know, for the past 2 weeks, something's been gnawing at me, a premonition of something. I just can't figure out exactly what, however, where can we know what awaits us? I feel the approach of a big wave, I feel it as if an animal senses danger. A bad premonition? Julia hurriedly asked. I don't know, I can't define it. It's some kind of fear, but strange as it may sound, it's sweet, and it's like longing, but it's not a premonition of love. Toya quickly warned Julia against any false guesses. No, not that. It's something, related to Pablo. Oh, Toya, Julia exclaimed immediately, enough of this. You can't torment yourself to such an extent. What can you do about it if it happens? It's been 7 years. However, Toya, ignoring her, continued. I had a dream on Friday. I remember it down to the smallest detail. Pablo was sitting behind the wheel of our car, and I was walking towards him. It was empty all around, no people, the city seemed deserted. We were the only ones in this ghost town. I was wearing a light dress, the sky was a bright blue, the sun was shining, and the air was filled with pleasant scents. Pablo saw me through the windshield and began waving, beckoning me. I approached the car, opened the door, sat next to him, and extended my face for a kiss, as I always do. But suddenly, I got scared and recoiled. In front of me was someone who looked like Pablo, but he wasn't Pablo at all. I clearly saw that this person with Pablo's appearance was not him, as if he had put on a mask. Julia, with her mascaraed eyes wide open, was listening intently and didn't interrupt. Toya continued. What's amazing is that, along with an obvious fear, I also felt a pleasant feeling towards this non-Pablo, not repelling but positive, an attractive charm, fear, and, along with it, an allure. In short, I don't know what it was. The impression left was one of bewilderment, when your eyes are crossed and you have the silliest smile, as if someone hit you on the head with a brick. And also a sense of firm certainty that changes are approaching. Perhaps I'll know something. Maybe Pablo wants to tell me something previously unknown? Julia shifted and chuckled. Oh my God. Toya, it was just a dream. Don't dwell on it. But if you wish, I can check. I have the phone number of a psychic. Julia, you haven't changed, Toya laughed. Then the door opened, and Katerina herself appeared in the office doorway. Toya obediently jumped up from the couch. Oh, Toya. You are the one I need, Katerina said loudly, pointing her hand directly at Toya. The head, tapping her heels on the laminate, walked to her workplace, silently casting an evaluating glance at Julia, not uttering a word to express her feelings toward the lady who boldly occupied her couch. Have you finished your work? Do you have 5 minutes for a conversation? Katerina asked. Yes, of course, Toya replied. But the head persistently looked at Julia, awaiting her reaction to her stern gaze. Katerina, may I? Julia, I'm asking you to leave my office. And then, with a touch of indignation but in a motherly manner, she added, Julia, acting like a chatty magpie, I swear. Go, as I told you. Julia got up from the couch, looking dissatisfied, and fluttered out of the door. The head sighed, shifting her businesslike gaze to Toya. With a gesture, she invited the cleaner to take a seat closer to her own royal throne. Toya moved and listened attentively. Was there some kind of complaint against her? Toya, I want to offer you the position of civil registration specialist. And she immediately flicked her palm upwards. Don't interrupt, listen. You've been working for me for 5 years, and I've been closely observing you for 5 years. You're a good fit for me. But what about my education? Toya managed to interject. Nonsense. If necessary, I'll send you for further education. Aren't you capable of handling documents for the registration of civil status acts, marriage certificates, divorce, birth, death? Toya shrugged again in confusion. She didn't even have to ask, she was being offered the position. Indeed, changes were ahead. By the way, what's also very important is that you fit the part externally. I'm assigning you to handle solemn registrations. What do you think of the offer? In my opinion, it's the best, Katerina confidently declared. What if I can't do it? Toya timidly murmured. Whether you can or can't, you won't know until you start working. Just do the job, and that's it. Toya grinned broadly. The winds of change were blowing. Why are you smiling so sweetly and openly? Katerina shook her head and pointed at Toya. Deal? She said more affirmatively than inquiringly. In short, tomorrow you'll get everything sorted out. So, I won't be a cleaner tomorrow? Katerina looked at Toya with a meaningful expression. Are you silly, or do you just pretend to be? She exclaimed and waved her hands. No, take a look at her. I've already found a new floor cleaner, so tomorrow, come to the office in your dress code outfit at the former Chita Bravo's place. Although, imagine that finding a normal cleaner is also a problem. Tomorrow, we have no registrations, we'll discuss everything, I'll show you and explain everything, and the girls will help you. Go ahead. My grandmother always used to say, go ahead, Toya, she responded with enthusiasm. See? Oh, these poor girls. Tell Julia that if she starts acting bossy here, I'll put her in the corner on peas, the headmistress exclaimed, getting a little worked up. Once again, a ray of hope shone in Toya's life. After her husband's death, Toya no longer liked to hope, she simply lived wherever the river took her. Based on her bitter experience, one day Toya decided to make the following conclusion a principle for herself: don't hope, then there won't be disappointments. Yet today, she rushed home to her twins as if she were a bird, flying freely, perhaps even happy. She would now tell the boys that their mother had been chosen again, that she had been offered a prestigious position, and that she would almost be like an actress playing the lead role on the theater stage. Toya peeked into the boys' bedroom. The covers had slipped off both of them. Celso had curled up into a ball, burying his nose in the pillow, while Manuel sprawled on his back, his arms and legs splayed out, sleeping with his mouth open and making funny little snores. They were already 10 years old. One of them was named Manuel Delgado, who was the first to enter the world, and 5 minutes later, another one, Celso Delgado, announced his arrival with loud cries, and now they were growing up, soon to become adult men, strong and hairy. What kind of men would they become? What path would they take? Oh, how difficult and yet beautiful the mother's role was. Toya covered the boys with blankets and stood over them for a while. Returning to the living room, which served as her bedroom, she approached the portrait of Pablo hanging above the dresser in a simple wooden frame. A nightlight softly illuminated the room. In its dim light, dark, watercolor-like shadows spread along the walls from various objects. It was quiet, with only the steady ticks of the grandmother's wall clock breaking the silence. Toya gazed tenderly at the photographic features of Pablo's face. Suddenly, a tear welled up and rolled down her cheek. She wiped it away and whispered, "Pablo, where are you now? What do you want to tell me? Please come to me in my dreams again. Maybe I'll understand you." She wiped away the tears that were running down her cheeks, blew her nose into a handkerchief she took from the pocket of her house dress, and looked at her husband's portrait again, trying to re-examine his face and remember it so that in her dream, if he were to come to her, she wouldn't mistake him for someone else. Toya didn't notice when she fell asleep again before dawn. She had a strange dream once more. She saw a maternity hospital, the sounds of laboring women's moans and the cries of newborns came from somewhere. It was like an ensemble. Medical women in white robes and caps appeared, pushing a stretcher with swaddled babies. What was Toya doing here? She wasn't a laboring woman. She was wearing the same light dress as in the previous dream, slowly and cautiously walking down the corridor. Suddenly, she froze in place because she saw a middle-aged woman coming out of the office with a sign saying head of the department. She was dressed in an expensive mink coat, an extravagant hat, leather gloves in one hand, and a black leather bag in the other. Everything about her indicated that she was a very wealthy person. She passed Toya with a beautiful, confident gait. In the space left behind, there echoed the sound of her leather boots' heels clacking, and a faint, intoxicating trail of expensive French perfume lingered in the air. Toya, as if mesmerized, watched the woman, but then the woman stopped, turned towards Toya, and Toya woke up. She sat up on the disassembled sofa, not understanding where she was or in which dimension. She turned her head back and forth, seeing her familiar surroundings as if she had returned to the present day from a completely different reality. She looked at the clock. Thank God, it was only 6 o'clock. She started thinking her dream over. The woman. Who was she? What did this dream mean? Toya was overwhelmed with a fear that sent shivers down her spine. She was stubbornly trying to remember the woman's face from the dream, but nothing came to her. The woman turned her head, and, no, Toya couldn't picture her face. A continuous, flowing blur, a maternity hospital, a wealthy and respectable lady. What nonsense was this? Toya decided not to tell Julia anything for now and chose to observe her dreams, which had been overwhelming her in recent days. She realized that her dreams were becoming regular, and perhaps Toya would see much more in these short films that were still incomprehensible. The most important thing was not to be afraid because, as Julia said, it was just a dream. Life had taught Toya to work hard in various professions, which changed out of necessity, and in the fields of motherhood and self-improvement. Even cleaning rooms, seemingly a straightforward task, was a quite complex activity that required knowledge of how to wash and clean properly as well as certain skills. After all, why did a room always look untouched by water and a cloth after one person cleaned it, while after another person cleaned it, the room sparkled and everything was in order? So, the new job went smoothly for Toya. There were certainly some stumbling blocks, but the overall result was a well-manicured lawn. Dealing with documents didn't pose any serious difficulties for Toya, given her background as a former design engineer. Qualities such as precision, clarity, simplicity, and clarity were required in this profession, and they were her professional qualities, her habits. Toya was a diligent, conscientious, and responsible person with a well-developed sense of self-discipline. She had been trained in this by the orphanage caregivers, her grandmother Dorothea, and ultimately by her profession as a designer, which made her an excellent registrar. Dealing with solemn ceremonies was sometimes challenging. It required a certain degree of acting skills, the absence of stage fright, the ability to present oneself on stage, the correct intonation of one's voice, and many other skills. Toya, open to criticism, spent enough time and effort honing all these skills. She was genuinely interested in her new role. For her performances, she was immediately ordered 2 outfits, a long, shimmering malachite green dress and a costume consisting of a skirt, a blazer, and a light blouse. Julia was concerned about her appearance and took her to a salon, securing her a permanent stylist and manicurist. Working at the Registro Civil undoubtedly left a strong imprint on Toya's personality over time. Life had taken a stable, established course without abrupt waterfalls or steep rapids. The only thing that brought her sadness and anxiety was loneliness. Not that Toya wanted to meet a man to restore her femininity. No. The loneliness without Pablo made her sadly cry into her pillow at night. Toya continued to love her deceased husband with all her heart, even more so, and she couldn't imagine anyone else beside her except Pablo. As for her sons? No, she would not betray Manuel and Celso. No amount of words or explanations would make them understand if, by any chance, someone other than Pablo appeared in her life. They would never forgive her. She didn't need anyone but Pablo, the one she loved passionately. That's what Toya thought, or maybe she had just convinced herself to think that way. Days turned into months. Toya noticed that she was no longer having strange, speaking dreams, as if someone had given her a break from them. She had no doubt that these dreams were speaking to her or warning her about something. They were in the form of symbolic plots, meant to convey something, whether about the past, present, or future. But then, one day, the strange dreams returned. Another workday had gone well for Toya. She was satisfied with all the ceremonies she had conducted in the hall. They had been lively and vibrant. She was very tired. 30 couples were getting married, dressed in wedding attire, with loving eyes, lush bouquets, and champagne popping. The wedding day is the official and solemn registration of relationships and the birth of a family. How much genuine happiness! After each ceremony, taking a short break in her office, Toya reflected, fools. As it is known, everything is just beginning after the wedding. From tomorrow on, life will lay complex paths and present tangled quests and challenges. And you will have to show wisdom, knowledge, resourcefulness, determination, and overcome your fears to conquer these wild rivers. And if there's love between you two, it will help. Understanding, readiness to sacrifice, that's what matters for two people, and of course, good health. During these moments of rest, reclining in her chair, Toya seemed to be preparing a speech, a toast that she would raise a glass to in honor of the newlyweds. As usual, Toya told her children a bedtime story. "My sweethearts, I wonder until what age I will keep telling you stories, huh?" she asked, tousling their hair one by one. "We won't leave you, Mom. You'll keep telling us stories until we're very old," Celso replied. "Oh, by that time, I'll be up in the sky with Dad." "Okay, boys, my tongue is dry today. I talk at work, and I talk at home. How about you guys create a story for me tomorrow? Deal?" "Deal," Manuel replied with joy. "Great. Good night, twins." She kissed her sons on their foreheads and left the room, closing the door. Neither Manuel nor Celso required much emotional effort from her. In that sense, they resembled Toya herself in her school days. They studied well, didn't bring back any notes from school, and both attended a sports school. But Manuel was quick, assertive, and could easily get into some adventure, like skipping a class, while Celso was slow, ponderous, somewhat boring, and preferred to philosophize and weigh pros and cons. The twins, however, did differ in their inner organization as they grew older. In early childhood, they looked almost identical, practically indistinguishable to an outsider, especially to the untrained eye. Over time, differences appeared in their appearance. Manuel began to resemble Pablo, while Celso resembled Toya. Sometimes, it was tempting for her to look at her children and note these variations. Toya was lying down in bed, but she couldn't sleep. Opposite the couch, there was Pablo's portrait in a frame, drawing her gaze, and she lost herself in Pablo's eyes. She didn't notice when she fell asleep. She was drawn into a distant void, like Alice in Wonderland, and found herself in a house. It was a large, two-story house reminiscent of a castle. The ground floor had a spacious living room, a dining room, a kitchen with a pantry, and a bathroom with a shower. The second floor had private bedrooms with facilities, a hallway, a library, an office, and a billiard room. The facade of the building had flower beds with designer ideas. Behind the house, there was a well-groomed garden. A path led to it, and on the sides of the path were marble statues of Greek gods. Beyond the trees and other vegetation, there was a greenish lake with water lilies glistening in the sun. It was clear that this was not an ordinary person's house. Toya felt like an unknown wind brought her there. She appeared in the living room, as if out of nowhere. The room resembled the hall of an English castle, adorned with fine woodwork. In the distance, a fireplace was blazing, and two comfortable armchairs were placed nearby. A massive chandelier of copper and crystal hung from the ceiling, and the walls were adorned with works of art. It was dimly lit. Footsteps could be heard, and a lady entered the living room. It was the same woman from the maternity hospital that Toya had seen in her previous dream. She was wearing a silk floral robe and saying something. Her voice was velvety and well-mannered. Toya thought that this lady was probably an opera singer, and she sang mezzo-soprano. The words she spoke were unclear, only the sound of a beautiful voice could be heard. The lady was addressing someone, either giving instructions or expressing dissatisfaction, though she didn't raise her voice. After a minute, a young man entered the living room, dressed smartly, resembling a businessman from an office. He looked up, and, oh God, it was Pablo. Pablo! Toya rushed toward him, but the man turned away and didn't react. Toya called him again and was puzzled because Pablo paid no attention to her. He was indeed looking past Toya, as if she were invisible to him. She realized once again that the man in the form of Pablo was somehow different from the real Pablo, like he was wearing a stretched mask. However, despite this, Toya still felt the captivating effect of his charm, and she felt drawn to him. At that moment, a young woman appeared. She was likely crying, as her eyes were red and swollen, and she continued to sob out of inertia. The lady in the robe sternly and categorically uttered some words, to which the girl responded with a loud whisper, hissing like a snake. "May you die, you cursed witch." And she rushed out of the living room, while the lady, laughing with an unpleasant laugh, turned her face toward Toya, and Toya woke up. Try as she might, Toya couldn't remember even the slightest feature of the lady's face. It was just a blank white spot once again. Her forehead was sweaty, and her gaze immediately fell on the portrait. No, in her dream, Toya had seen a completely different person there, despite the strong resemblance to Pablo. Something was different about Pablo's features, with different lines on his face and a kinder, purer, simpler look. Toya noticed a pattern. These strange dreams only occurred from Thursday to Friday. She laughed, remembering a childhood rhyme they used to recite with the girls in the orphanage when they played at guessing their future husbands. From Thursday to Friday, from Friday to Friday. Starlet, whoever loves, will appear in a dream. Toya made arrangements with Julia for her to come over in the evening. Toya didn't drive, but Julia was an avid driver. Valerio, Julia's husband, had bought her a red Mazda, and Julia zipped around town in it. Overall, Julia's life had gone smoothly with her easygoing and conflict-free personality since leaving the orphanage. Sometimes, that's just how life goes. However, Toya knew that Julia's beloved Valerio was cheating on her. Yet Toya hadn't spoken up or found out whether Julia was aware of it. If she wasn't aware, tough times lay ahead for Julia. Julia was listening to her friend's astonishing story and insisted on calling a familiar psychic or wizard or whatever they were called. Yes, it's a woman, not a man. She's a cool lady, not a charlatan. She has an inherited gift from her great-grandmother, Julia argued. They're all charlatans. You know, my grandmother, Dorothea, was skilled in coffee ground divination. A high art. She could tell you things and say things that you wouldn't believe, but you'd end up believing them, Toya laughed. Your grandmother Dorothea should have charged money for her readings. She'd have made a fortune. No, Toya, I'm telling you, this psychic is the real deal. Julia made the call and scheduled an appointment with the person who not only possessed psychic abilities but also seemed capable of deciphering dreams. However, Toya didn't meet this psychic until 2 years later, and it happened under different circumstances. A year passed, then a second. Toya continued to work successfully at the Registro Civil and raised her twins. She weathered crazy disputes with Julia's husband. It was the kind of melodrama that could be turned into a literary work. Nevertheless, the couple stayed together, and it all ended happily. Julia was lucky in that regard. The longing for Pablo had dulled, transforming into a calm, meandering river that smoothly bypassed the occasional boulders of resurfacing memories. Toya had these dreams 3 more times, with the same arrogant lady and the man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Pablo as the protagonists. But these dreams, too, had grown tiresome. She tried not to dwell on what she had seen in them because they hadn't brought any significant changes to her life. She preferred not to delve into her speculations about them and left the contents of these dreams stored away in the attic of her memory without further analysis. One Saturday, there were many solemn marriage registrations scheduled. Toya didn't always process the paperwork herself. She had assistants, so she might not personally know the couples who had decided to get married. The Saturday registrations began. After a particularly festive ceremony, Toya settled into her favorite chair, removed her slightly uncomfortable new shoes, and ordered coffee. Leaning back, she closed her eyes. Unexpectedly, something inside her stirred beneath her breastbone. Toya felt physical discomfort, and a lump rose in her throat. She needed more fresh air. She gripped the armrests of her chair in panic. "What's happening to me?" she said in alarm. The last thing she needed was some kind of panic attack. There were couples waiting for her. Toya forced herself to stand up, poured a glass of water from a pitcher, and drank it eagerly. That helped a bit. She walked over to the window, where the birch candles rustled with their autumn yellow leaves, and took deep breaths. The physical distress subsided somewhat, but the feeling of inner discomfort remained. Her heart pounded as if she were deeply agitated. Yes, she was upset about something. Her children? Toya glanced at the clock, then quickly dialed the number of the boys' homeroom teacher. Was everything all right with the boys? Toya, they're in their 6th period literature class. Both of them are in the classroom, the teacher said. What was happening to her? Over the PA system, the voice of her assistant called for her to proceed with the registration. Toya took a deep breath, exhaled fully, and, pulling herself together, went to work. Her assistant, Marina, had meticulously prepared all the necessary documents on the table, and Toya just needed to put on the chain with the coat of arms. They had 1 minute left and were ready to begin. The assistant opened the white and gold door of the marble hall and invited the wedding couple inside for the ceremony. Mendelssohn's March began to play. Toya took her position, put on the appropriate expression, and cast a friendly glance at the couple as they entered. But what was this? The ground shifted beneath her feet, the furniture, the carpet, the walls, the hall, the people, everything turned upside down. Toya tightly closed her eyes, then abruptly opened them. There was Pablo, holding the hand of a lovely woman in a white dress, alive and unharmed. He smiled in his festive attire, anticipating the celebration. Her living Pablo, her Pablo. The whole world suddenly spun in the air and returned to its original place. Pablo! Toya shouted in a state of sheer frenzy. She sprang out from behind the table, clutching it, and rushed toward the groom. Pablo, is it you? Is it you? She asked frantically, shaking the man, grabbing onto his hands, and clenching the lapels of his jacket. The onlookers in the hall became bewildered. The guests started buzzing, and some people, possibly relatives, swiftly approached Toya and the groom, bombarding them with questions about what had just happened. The director rushed over, and other employees followed, but Toya couldn't see anyone else around except for Pablo. The poor man was utterly confused. For several seconds, shaken by the unexpectedness of the situation, the man couldn't utter a word. However, soon, coming to his senses, he finally said in bewilderment, "Wait, I don't understand anything." "Stop, you're mistaken, I'm not Pablo." Toya stared at him with wild eyes, her hands on his chest, crying. "Pablo. It's me, Toya. Don't you recognize me? Pablo, my God, how can this be? You died. I buried you. How is it possible?" The bride, pushed aside by the turmoil, stood there in astonishment. Her mind was racing as she realized that her groom might have some hidden secret. He was much older, in his 40s, and who knew what stories from his past he might be hiding. Katerina approached Toya. She was herself on the verge of shock, but politely apologized to the agitated crowd and, hugging Toya, asked her kindly, "Let's all go to my office." "My dear Toya, there's no need for a scene, please calm down. We'll sort everything out." The man gently and timidly took Toya's hands in his own. He repeated again, with understanding, empathy, and tact, but still he didn't completely understand anything. "Listen, my name is Salvador. Salvador Castro. You're making some kind of mistake. Please calm down. If you don't believe me, take a look at my documents." Toya couldn't take her eyes off his face. There was Pablo standing right in front of her, and that was all that mattered. Why wouldn't he admit it? She suddenly rushed to the table, grabbed the first thing she could find, the prepared marriage certificate, and saw that it had the same name the groom had just mentioned. "It can't be," Toya barely moved her lips. "Pablo, it's you, isn't it? Marina, bring my passport from my bag in the office. I'll show you right now." Toya continued to stare intensely at the man. A silent scene unfolded. Here, the assistant returned quickly and handed over the passport. With trembling fingers, Toya pulled a photograph from beneath the passport's cover and handed it to the man. "This is my husband, Pablo Delgado." He passed away many years ago. The groom took the card and was dumbfounded once more. In the photo, he was himself. The only difference was that the person in the photograph appeared about 10 years younger, but it was this man, Salvador Castro. Silence fell over the hall. Salvador absent-mindedly ran his hand across his face. "I don't understand anything." "I haven't died yet," the groom blurted out, as if an idea had suddenly occurred to him. He turned to his bride. "Salvador, is the wedding canceled?" she asked, her voice sounding defeated and hopeless. "Nora, my dear," Salvador exclaimed. "Don't look at me like that. I don't understand what's happening here. Is this some kind of divorce or a bold prank? Did someone set up this farce? Who hired you, damn it? What do you want from me? If it's money, name your price. I'll pay whatever you say." "Just leave us alone," the groom demanded hysterically. Then he nervously requested, addressing the director. "Director, just register us as husband and wife without any celebration. Just register us." "What's your name?" he asked, turning to Toya. "Toya," she replied softly. "This is not a prank. You look incredibly like my late husband, identical." Toya gazed into the depths of his eyes with profound sadness and suddenly gasped loudly. "Oh my God, you're the guy from my dreams, the one wearing a mask." The groom was even more surprised, shook his head like a dog coming out of a river, and, without raising his voice, said, "Toya, I can't make sense of any of this right now. It's some kind of incredible mysticism, the mystery of the century, I swear, but look closely at the photos, it's not me." He extended his hand to return the photograph. "Yes, I've already realized that it's not you," Toya said indifferently and abruptly, as if she had just fully comprehended the situation. "Who are you, then?" "Who?" "I just want to know that," she said, recognizing that she wouldn't learn or achieve anything more here and now. Completely indifferent, as if all her energy had been drained, Toya slowly walked toward the staff door. "Wait, Toya, hold on," Salvador called out. She turned, waiting. "We need to figure this out. We have to, there's no other way. Just," he hesitated for a moment. "Please marry us. I'm begging you." But Nora, the bride, had disappeared. Toya made up her mind and went to see the psychic. She didn't call ahead, she didn't tell anyone, not even Julia. She just went on a whim. A girl, likely the psychic's secretary, greeted her. She led Toya to a separate room and asked her to wait for a call. Toya looked around, a typical reception area, gray wallpapered walls, neutral curtains on the windows, a comfortable sofa, a coffee table, an armchair, and chairs. After about 10 minutes, the secretary invited her to enter the opposite room. In the room where Toya found herself, subdued lighting illuminated antique-style furniture, perhaps genuine antiques or well-made replicas. A candle burned in a silver candlestick on a massive carved table. The setting was reminiscent of what one might see in today's enticing TV series. After a minute, a woman emerged from behind heavy curtains. She approached the table and sat in a chair with wooden swirls. The woman had black hair styled into a high bun, with a silver band gleaming at the hairline. Her eyes were also black, framed by lush, extended lashes. Her nails were painted a dark color, and her long, slender fingers were adorned with exclusive silver rings, while unique silver or white gold earrings dangled from her ears. Where do they find all this paraphernalia? Flashed through Toya's mind. What would you like to discuss? The psychic asked without introducing herself. My husband, Toya replied. Hello. The psychic stared at her, and Toya felt a slight nervousness. Are you Toya or Luz? Toya instinctively raised her eyebrows, as if wanting to ask a question. But the woman preempted it. They wanted to name you Luz before you were born. But when you arrived, they named you Toya after your maternal great-grandmother. That's right, Toya said, her eyes widening in surprise. Your husband has been dead for a long time, or rather, he's been gone for about 10 years. What do you want to know about this? Toya shrank under the weight of the truth, but she withstood the woman's penetrating gaze. You're right, he passed away over 9 years ago. But recently, there's been a person who looks exactly like my deceased husband, as if they were 2 peas in a pod. I want to know who he is. I mean, everything about him. Do you have a photograph of your husband with you? Toya nodded and reached into her bag. She handed the woman the photograph she always carried under her passport cover. The psychic stared at the photo, only looking intently without making any hand movements or other manipulations. Then she recoiled as if shedding a manifested energy cluster, emotionlessly saying, "This man in the photo died of his own accord. It was an accident, a technical mishap. There was no foul play. He's Norman or Pablo." Toya furrowed her brow, tempted to ask, "How did you guess the name from the picture?" But the woman continued, "Yes, that's right, he was called Pablo. Why do you say there's no foul play? The investigation confirmed that a freight truck hit him into the ditch, and the car exploded, and Pablo burned to death," Toya said with tears in her eyes. "The truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. Various stories happen. Sometimes accidents are orchestrated. Do you have a photograph of the second person who looks like Pablo? Preferably the physical one, not on a phone. I thought that this might be needed. But these are general photos. They are with our working photographer, not portraits. Here, take a look." The psychic unhurriedly sorted through the photos, examining especially carefully and attentively the one she had selected from several. "Fascinating," she muttered. "They're practically identical. It's difficult to distinguish, even for a relative accustomed to this similarity." She scrutinized the photos again with her unflinchingly penetrating gaze, as if special X-ray-like rays emanated from her eyes. Then she recoiled from the cards once more, releasing a burst of energy, and exhaled, saying, "These photos are not of Pablo." "I know it's not Pablo there," Toya said excitedly. "I need to understand who this doppelganger is. Who is he?" The woman, without any change in her perception of the observed material, spoke with an even voice and a stone face. "He is his blood brother, a twin. You can verify my words by conducting a DNA analysis. I see a blood relationship." "DNA? How can I do that? Pablo is no longer alive. Your children. You have twins, don't you?" At this question, Toya was once again stunned. "If these are Pablo's children, then they are his blood nephews," she said. She picked up one of the photos again and gazed into the candle's flame. "Nephews of Salvador. This man's name is Salvador. He was given that name in infancy." This time, Toya let out a small gasp. "He was given that name by his adoptive parents. He carries their surname," the psychic concluded. "My goodness, how do you know all of this? Did Julia tell you something?" Toya couldn't hold back. The psychic wore a mysterious expression, and her lips barely twitched in a faint smile. "I just see it, dear. Julia has nothing to do with this. I can tell you that Salvador is currently successful in his endeavors, perhaps in construction or home repair, but unfortunately, he's unsuccessful in matters of personal happiness. I must admit, I'm bewildered. Although, when I think about it rationally, the version of a blood relationship that Pablo has a twin brother is the only reasonable and plausible explanation. Now, let me tell you about the dreams." And the psychic listened to the tale of those recurring dreams Toya had been having for several years. "Take the candle on the table and drip the wax into the water," the woman instructed. Toya, with trembling hands, overturned the burning candle, allowing drops of wax to fall into the water, forming solid clumps. The psychic examined them for an extended period, then recoiled again, exhaling. "I see. The lady from your dream is Pablo's grandmother. Salvador is his brother. The woman sending the curse is the mother of the brothers. She appeared in the dream in her younger form. Their mother has long passed away. You see, dear Toya, dreams are irrational phenomena. They can mix things up, change the sequence, or combine distant times and individuals into one storyline. You may see yourself as an adult with your parent, who appears as a child, and so on. Therefore, deciphering, as you say, dreams can only be done by taking into account all these intricacies. I can shed some light on certain aspects, but it will take a lot of time. Not now, I'm tired. Our conversation for today is over. What should I do now? Please, give me advice and help me. My soul is restless, Toya pleaded. You have two options. First, do nothing and continue living as you have for the past 2 years. You have been living well. Second, confirm the DNA relationship between Pablo and Salvador and, using this irrefutable evidence, start inquiries, perhaps beginning with the maternity hospital where the twins were born. Find out why they never knew about each other. I foresee fascinating and astonishing details in the investigation. Come with Salvador to me, if you can. Interaction with a living person will reveal more details. All right, I will try. Thank you. Toya settled her bill with the secretary, who escorted her to the exit without displaying any emotion whatsoever. All her life, Toya had never believed in magicians, sorcerers, fortune tellers, or seers, considering it all nonsense. She explained any such abilities as mere human intuition and psychology. The magician was most likely an experienced, knowledgeable psychologist who observed keenly, and certainly not a real wizard. However, today she found herself deeply impressed. She realized she trusted this woman and was genuinely intrigued by her. By the way, Toya remembered that she had never come across any advertisements for the services of this particular magician, whose name remained unknown for now. In the evening, Salvador Castro called Toya. Naturally, she expected Salvador to arrive soon, as he had been restless ever since the incident at the Registro Civil, feeling that there was hidden information behind the situation and that it concerned him directly. This information had to be unearthed. He felt that there was something of utmost importance about himself that he didn't know, something that defined the essence of his life. He confidently dialed the registration office's number. I'm listening, she responded after a few rings. Hello, Toya. It's Salvador Castro. Good evening. Yes, I recognized your voice. I'd like to meet with you, please. Find some time for me. We need to talk, and the sooner, the better. Can you tell me when you're free? I wouldn't mind talking to you either, Salvador. I have some information that might, let's say, surprise you. During the phone call, Toya strategically built a wall, keeping some distance, thereby intensifying the intrigue. Over the past few days, she had completely come to terms with the fact that Salvador was, of course, not Pablo miraculously risen from the dead. She could now clearly identify all the differences in the appearance of the two newly discovered twins. She noticed distinctions in their voices, their mannerisms, their overall behavior, and even their worldviews, since she remembered vividly what her Pablo had been like. However, she admitted to herself that the magnetic attraction she had felt towards the man in her dreams had been rekindled. Well then, I'm expecting an incredible story. So, when and where shall we meet? Salvador asked. Let's meet tomorrow at 6. How about the Harmony Cafe, just a block away from the Registro Civil? Is that suitable for you? Got it. See you there. Goodbye, and Toya hung up. The night flew by in an instant. She had fallen into a deep sleep, waking up at exactly 5:30, well-rested, full of energy, in a good mood, and confident that all her worries and fears had dissipated. Indeed, she felt a surge of activity and a thirst for action, along with a strong desire to embark on a new venture. Even if this new venture turned out to be an investigation with the goal of uncovering everything about the origins of Pablo and Salvador and discovering the reasons for their separation or estrangement, who exactly was behind the tragedy of these two close relatives losing each other. When Salvador came to the table and greeted her, Toya became completely convinced that, despite their striking resemblance, he was different from his brother. There were subtle differences in his facial features and contours. Pablo had rounder cheeks, while Salvador's were slightly elevated. Pablo had a broader forehead, whereas Salvador's was narrower. Pablo had plump, smoothly contoured lips, while Salvador's were thinner. Both had brown eyes. But now Toya could see that Pablo's eyes were a shade lighter, while Salvador's were darker. Even their hairstyles were different. Pablo preferred a very short buzz cut, while Salvador sported a more stylish haircut with longer hair. Their voices also varied, with Salvador's being deeper and Pablo's having a slightly higher pitch, and their mannerisms further differentiated them, with Pablo being more modest and reserved, while Salvador was more relaxed and carefree, and so on. Toya initiated the conversation. Yesterday, I visited a psychic. Toya, her interlocutor, interrupted again. Are we going to talk seriously or indulge in nonsense? All my plans have been disrupted. My wife left me, my colleagues are bewildered, and I finally want to find out what the heck is going on, and you're talking about a psychic. Wait, let me finish. I don't intend to recount the details of the visit right now. I want to get straight to the point. Salvador, you and Pablo are two blood brothers, twins. She cast a stern, warning look at him, urging him not to interrupt. The psychic told me this. Salvador coughed in surprise. I have one request, Toya continued without giving him a chance to collect his thoughts. Conduct a molecular genetic examination, a DNA analysis. DNA of who? Salvador asked, perplexed. Your DNA and that of my children. Pablo and I have twin boys as well. If there's a match, then they are your nephews, and that means you and Pablo are biological brothers. Salvador fell silent, staring at the attractive woman, who didn't seem like a fool. He supported his right elbow on the table and rested his temple on his fingers. You know, Toya, he responded after some contemplation, from the very beginning, I had precisely this version in mind, that Pablo is my brother. Toya became cautious, expecting an interesting explanation, and she wasn't disappointed. I was adopted at birth. Unfortunately, my adoptive parents are no longer alive. They were wonderful people, and I loved them very much. My dad passed away from cancer, and my mom survived him by 2 years. When I was a child, they kept my true origins a secret. Maybe they would have kept it a secret forever, but my dad fell seriously ill, and they decided to come clean with me. I guess they thought it was fair to me. It was really tough, I won't deny it. I struggled emotionally. But they couldn't tell me anything about my biological parents because they knew absolutely nothing about them. They adopted me from the maternity ward, and during adoption, neither party is provided with any information about the other. Pablo also mentioned that he was abandoned at the maternity ward, Toya added. You know, when I saw the photo of your husband, the first thought that came to mind was that he's my brother. People can't be so identical for no reason. They can look somewhat alike, but not to the extent of being clones. Imagine, Toya, this thought actually made me feel good. I thought, if I'm correct, that it was just amazing. That means I'm not alone on this earth. Toya smiled subtly in response to his kind thoughts. It's a pity that Pablo is gone. I'm absolutely sure that we are brothers. If that's the case, then I'm not alone. I have nephews. Salvador also smiled. I agree to the DNA. Toya nodded. It was evident that she was about to bid him farewell. Wait a moment, Toya. Are you in a hurry? Toya performed her favorite gesture, she shrugged. My children are independent guys. Actually, I'm not in a hurry. Then I suggest we have dinner. To be honest, I'm as hungry as a whale. I haven't eaten for almost the entire day, but it's not just about that. I just feel light right now. Suddenly, I'm at ease. I want to relax. I work every day with overwhelming stress, otherwise, I wouldn't survive. Please accept my offer, don't refuse. Let's get to know each other better because we have some big joint ventures ahead. He grinned widely, and Toya's heart fluttered a bit. His smile reminded her of Pablo, a remarkable similarity. All right, let's have dinner, she said. Then please join me in the car. We'll go to a different restaurant. Over dinner with a glass of wine, Toya and Salvador talked animatedly. Toya learned that Salvador held one of the top positions in a construction company founded by his adoptive father and his friend. However, she didn't see a movie-like business with insane money, adventures, and crimes, but rather a tough, risk-filled life of hard workers who lived day by day and survived in their own way. Salvador wanted a family and children. After the dreadful truth revealed by his adoptive parents, he yearned even more strongly for a stable family life. The horror lay in the fact that he couldn't fathom how people could abandon their own children. Yet he couldn't find a way to settle down. He hadn't formed serious relationships with any of the women who crossed his path. Nora had a certain charm, despite the significant age difference. When a man is the elder partner, it's not as daunting. Any man, at any age, can be a groom. He fell in love with a young, charming doll, but the girl needed money and status. The dream of a strong family probably didn't touch her. After the incident at Registro Civil, Nora refused to listen to Salvador and vanished from his life. It hadn't been much time since that incident, but Salvador soon realized that he felt nothing for Nora anymore. All his thoughts were now focused on something else. And he almost married that girl. Toya eventually persuaded Salvador to visit the psychic with her. He could at least go beyond ordinary human curiosity. Besides, Salvador had never come into contact with mystical individuals before, and it seemed intriguing. Fine, Salvador agreed to go to this which for Toya's sake. On the appointed day, they entered a room furnished in an antique style. The psychic appeared before them in a long iridescent robe, adorned with silver and various gemstones. Her hair was loose and held in place with something like a headband. Just like last time, a candle in a silver candle holder was burning on the table, casting shadows around the room. Toya noticed a sardonic smile on Salvador's lips, but chose not to react. They sat down in front of the psychic. "Close your eyes," the psychic commanded Salvador. He reluctantly complied. All this hocus-pocus seemed ridiculous to him, but he had to keep the promise he made to Toya. The woman took a stone from a large crystal bowl and, leaning forward towards Salvador, began to move the stone, outlining his head and shoulders and making various airy figures with her hands. Her face remained impassive, and her eyes appeared glassy. Then she exhaled and shook off an energetic bundle, straightening up in her chair with elaborate wooden swirls. Salvador sat still with his eyes closed, as if in a trance. It was clear that the psychic had induced some sort of state resembling hypnosis. "Answer my questions with just 2 words, yes or no." Toya expected the psychic to start asking Salvador questions, and he would respond as if in a hypnosis session. However, something different happened. The psychic also closed her eyes and froze, not moving at all. Toya couldn't hear the questions the psychic was asking Salvador or the answers he was providing. She watched this silent dialogue with curiosity, but drowsiness overcame her. The concentrated silence in the room, the flickering flame, and the pleasant herbal scent that filled the air lulled her and made her body feel weightless, and Toya lost track of time. At some point, the psychic abruptly opened her black eyes and instructed Salvador to do the same. Salvador woke up as if he'd been bewitched. He stared at the sorceress as if under a spell. The woman shook off the energy coma again and, looking straight ahead, began to enumerate the factual material. "You went back in time to the early days of your existence. The initial scene, you see yourself lying in a crib with metal bars, and next to you is another crib where someone's hands have placed a baby. That's your brother. Next scene, you're crying, you can feel yourself being lifted, and you see a young woman. That's your mother. She touches your cheek with her lips, and you feel comfortable. Now you hear your mother's voice, she's singing a lullaby. Next scene, an office. On one side of the desk is a doctor in a white coat, and on the other side is your young mother. She's writing something on paper. The door opens, and another woman enters the room. That's your grandmother." As Salvador spoke the last words, he began to grimace, twisting his lips as if something inside him was breaking. The psychic, noticing Salvador's reaction, stopped speaking. She clapped her hands lightly, and Salvador, snapping out of it, returned to his normal self. He saw Toya, who had been sitting there like a statue, the psychic, and the fantastical setting of the room, and he remembered where he was. A woman in her senior years entered the room. Salvador mysteriously said, "A familiar face. It feels like I've seen her somewhere before." Your negative reaction to the elderly woman in the vision prevents me from continuing, otherwise, there could be a threat to your health, the psychic stated. I affirmed that Salvador and Pablo were separated by this woman. And what about the woman who appeared in my vision? Toya asked. It's the same woman. There is evil in her, Salvador responded, his eyes moistening. He pondered, our mother, she had a sorrowful, submissive expression. She was young and beautiful, with dark brown hair. She was in a state of dependency, they forced her. It's fascinating to know what compelled her to obey and sign away her children. Contrary to her earlier refusal to continue, the psychic turned to the man, commanding once again. Close your eyes and envision that elderly lady. As soon as she appears in your imagination, let me know. Salvador closed his eyelids and concentrated. He remained silent for about 30 seconds. I see her. She's entered, he quickly articulated. The psychic immediately brought a live flame to him, moved it before him, and then abruptly overturned the candle, pouring wax into the water basin. Open your eyes, she commanded. Salvador raised his eyelids and observed as the psychic gazed intensely into the water, where small clumps of wax floated like tiny boats. Finally, the sorceress triumphantly declared, "This woman is still alive." Toya and Salvador exchanged a simultaneous glance. Maybe you could also give me her address, Salvador quipped with a hint of sarcasm, but the psychic, amused by the ignorant fool, responded, I won't give you her address, but I will tell you that she is ill. Find your wicked grandmother, and then you will learn everything you're interested in. Where should we look for her? Toya asked rhetorically. You can start by checking the clinics. Besides her other ailments, she has diabetes. So, she's likely registered with an endocrinologist. Her name has something to do with the letter L. There is an L letter in her name, both at the beginning and in the middle. It's a name that's uncommon in the language. It's exotic, the psychic explained. The psychic turned to Salvador once more and asked, Do you remember her face? I will clap my hands, and you will recall the features of her face. Keep them in your memory. Look at this woman without taking your eyes off her. It should feel like she's seen you. Close your eyes. Salvador closed his eyes. The psychic clapped her hands, her gaze cold and unrelenting as she maintained her focus on the man. Seconds passed. Open your eyes, she finally commanded. Salvador came back to himself. He was tired and couldn't endure any more of these magical ordeals. The psychic released the energy with a heavy exhale. She was also at her limit. Your grandmother's name is Lorenza, she stated. Toya ran her hand across her forehead, cheek, and neck. She had never witnessed such a marvelous display of magic in her life. Check the clinics. Which ones? In which city? Are they here in our city or in other cities? Toya questioned. Dear guests, for today, that's all, the psychic hinted at their immediate departure. There might be geographical complications. Come back another time, but today, that's it. The visitors bid their host farewell and stepped out into the fresh air and sunlight. What do you think? Toya asked. Salvador shrugged. It's shocking, I can't seem to shake it off. I really saw her and our mother. It's rather strange. But then, who is my, or rather, our, father? In your dreams, did you see any other man? No, only Pablo, I mean you, Toya replied. Salvador paused and turned to Toya. What, Toya? What are you thinking? Toya, do I need to search for this woman, our grandmother? Maybe we should just leave things as they are. Aren't you curious about why they condemned you to such a fate? Why did they treat you so cruelly? Your life could have taken any direction. If this woman is still alive, you could uncover family secrets and find out who you really are. I mean, I'm not directly involved, it's your family, but I'm involved. I'm Pablo's children's mother, your captors. Or do you not believe that? Shall we proceed with the examination? Toya suggested. Salvador gripped her shoulders. Of course, we should. I'll call you. They parted ways, and 2 weeks later, Salvador showed Toya the results of a molecular genetic examination. Manuel and Celso were indeed Salvador's blood nephews, a fact that neither Toya Delgado nor Salvador Castro had doubted for a long time. At the age of 20, Julia graduated from college, having studied to become an interior designer. Caterina Morales mentored her and got her into an agency that held a prominent place in the city. In her years working at the agency, she excelled professionally, participating in numerous projects, both large and small, including some of her own design. Julia always seemed to have luck on her side. Regardless of the obstacles that arose in Julia's path, she appeared to float above them with the grace of a butterfly. Her life may have appeared effortlessly breezy to others, but beneath the surface, she navigated through bumps, potholes, strong currents, and whirlpools with a hidden strength. She never displayed the immense effort she sometimes exerted because Julia didn't like anyone seeing how difficult things could be for her. She was a sociable person, always wishing everyone well, thinking exclusively in positive terms, and remaining effortlessly upbeat. Perhaps it was precisely this lighthearted approach that made everything turn out the way she envisioned. Upon learning the news of what had transpired with Toya and Salvador at the psychic's place, Julia became excited like a child with a new project. She crafted an action plan and presented it not just to one friend, but to an entire group. Her friends were more than willing to support Salvador, who, in reality, turned out to be as charming and active as he had appeared in Toya's dream. As an interior designer, Julia had some connections and the right acquaintances within the client network. She carefully selected candidates, focusing her attention on specific individuals. They included professionals in the medical field, legal experts, municipal archives, and others. Toya marveled at the intricacies of Julia's thought process. At the right moments in life, her cognitive system functioned with astonishing precision and coordination, hitting the target bullseye. This little woman could execute even the most significant operations with the efficiency of a master. Toya couldn't help but think that Julia would have been the top spy if she were involved in espionage. Even Salvador, with his status, couldn't find as many tracks leading to the achievement of their goals as Julia had. At a certain point, Julia recalled a distant acquaintance, a prosecutor who had connections and access to the offices of institutions where entry was practically forbidden for the trio. She requested an audience and reintroduced herself to the prosecutor. His name was Domingo Grandes. He was a solid, middle-aged man in his 50s. He jokingly lamented that he was no longer young enough to win Julia over, but he found her absolutely captivating. She, attractive and intriguing, narrated an embellished tale about separated twin brothers and made it clear that, without a sinister mastermind behind the scenes, the chief scriptwriter and director of this touching story wouldn't be dealing with a 100% clean slate. She implied that the investigator could uncover the remaining secrets of a crime committed many years ago. Of course, the investigator was a significant help to them. Over the course of a month, Julia, Toya, and Salvador discovered that Pablo and Salvador were born in Maternity Hospital No. 1 in the city. 3 days after their birth, their mother submitted a statement renouncing her newborn twin sons. One of the infants was immediately adopted by a family. The names of the adoptive parents and all their information matched. Salvador confirmed it. The second twin was placed in a foster home after being discharged from the hospital. The current director provided the address of the orphanage where the boy had been sent when he was 3 years old. Toya and Julia couldn't help but shed tears. This orphanage was where they had spent their early years. But what about the mother of the twins? Who was she, and where was she now? This was what worried Salvador the most, but the investigator managed to trace her as well. At the maternity hospital, he gathered general information that proved sufficient to locate the woman who had given birth to twin boys on a specific date. Her name was Aurelia Herrero, a native of a village located just 100 kilometers from the city. In the village, the investigator learned that she had been taken away by a man who married her against the wishes of his parents, a man from a respectable city family. The girl's parents, Pablo and Salvador's grandparents, had already passed away. The investigator led a team of searchers to the village, where they saw the paternal home of the brothers, where their roots truly originated. Although the house was occupied by complete strangers, the owners welcomed the search team warmly. Remarkably, when they realized who they were dealing with, they handed Salvador a large wooden box, which contained photographs, letters, and 2 small notebooks with notes. What an unexpected find! They had discovered this box in the attic, stored in an old chest, and for some reason, they hadn't destroyed its contents, leaving them there until now. The time had finally come. The discovery astonished the search team, and the friends immediately began to study the archive, which ultimately provided them with a sense of who and where to look next. Salvador sat at his writing desk in his home office. The smallest of the 4 rooms in his comfortable apartment was designated as his office. A small, soft transformer couch was positioned to the right of the entrance, while floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the left wall and extended over the table. They were filled with literature. The desk was made of light wood and was situated so that the window's light fell on the left side. Above the couch, dear to his heart photographs were displayed in frames. On the table, a stylish marble writing instrument set with inkwells and pens adorned with gilded feathers stood alongside a desk lamp. Folders and a laptop lay on the table. The windows were covered with matte white curtains and greenish-blue drapes. The walls and furniture upholstery were colored a shade of seafoam green. Salvador examined the photographs in the wooden box that had been handed to him. A dull ache pulsed somewhere beneath his heart, but he felt detached from all the events, as if he were observing them from a distance. Could all these unbelievable, almost fantastical events really be happening to him? There were only a few photographs. He saw unfamiliar people, but easily recognized his real mother and father among them. They sat hand in hand, with happy, youthful smiles. On the back of the photograph was written, Aurelia and Eusebio, with some date. His father's name was Eusebio, and his mother's name was Aurelia. He simply stared at the familiar faces that had appeared out of nowhere, realizing how much he and Pablo resembled their father. They didn't need an analysis, it was immediately apparent that he was their dad. He set the photograph aside to be cleaned up and placed in a frame later. And here she was, the cunning grandmother. In the photo, the grandmother appeared much younger than the one Salvador had met in his vision during the visit to the Magina. She was a beautiful woman, perhaps too beautiful, with aristocratic features that spoke of breeding, but she emanated coldness, inaccessibility, and was devoid of warmth. A snow queen. It seemed her intentions were just as cold, to pierce the human heart with a shard of ice and freeze it. Salvador turned the photograph over and read the inscription, "To my beloved from Lorenza. Yours alone." There was no date, just a few words, but behind them lay an entire destiny, a sprawling novel. Who was this photo intended for, or whom did she want to give it to? Who was this beloved one? If she was giving this card as a keepsake, it meant she loved someone. Her beloved. This cold Lorenza had loved someone. Perhaps his grandfather? In the wooden box, there were 10 letters. They turned out to be from a certain Fernanda Lopez. It was ordinary correspondence between Aurelia and her friend, with conversations about everyday matters. However, Salvador's special attention was drawn to 2 letters. In one, Fernanda responded to Aurelia's story about meeting a guy who came to their village for a plein air session, how she fell in love with him, and that this guy was studying at the art academy. In the other letter, Fernanda wished Aurelia happiness in her married life, adding that marrying such a prominent and wealthy man was a stroke of luck. Apparently, Aurelia had told her about her marriage. So, there it was. Their father was an artist. Now, if only he could find out his true last name. These were valuable pieces of information. In the notebooks, there were many notes, hastily jotted down recipes, poems transcribed from collections, some addresses and phone numbers, as well as notes with unclear purposes. In short, a compilation of various things. Salvador, of course, first looked at the addresses and phone numbers. Among them, he immediately noticed two addresses, one in the capital city and the other in a neighboring village. He thought that Investigator Domingo would have quite a bit of work to do this week. Salvador's head was pounding as he tried to process all these numbers and speculations. He picked up his phone. He wanted to talk to Toya. She answered right away. "Toya, hello. It's Salvador. Can you spare a minute? When will you be free?" "Oh, Salvador, good evening. I'm already free, standing at the bus stop, waiting for the bus. May I come to pick you up now? Do you want me to take you home?" "Sure. I'm across from the square at the Registro Civil. Come by." They drove through the city in the evening, with the street lights illuminating their way. On the journey, Salvador shared the contents of the documents from the chest he had brought with him and said, "We need to check the two addresses without delay. My gut feeling tells me that Lorenza's grandmother lives in the capital city. Although her son studied in another city, there is no information related to that in the letters and notes. However, the capital city is mentioned. We need to hurry, as Lorenza's grandmother might leave this world sooner rather than later, and we need her alive. Listen, let's drop by Domingo's office. I think he's really interested in our case." And they headed to the investigator's office. Domingo had just closed his office and was about to leave the prosecutor's building when his mobile phone rang. He agreed to help and told them to come to his workplace. Salvador handed him the wooden box, saying, "Domingo, you know what needs to be done with this." "Goodbye," Salvador said. Salvador turned towards the entrance and helped Toya out of the car. "Toya, I want to ask you something," Salvador began, steering the conversation in a certain direction. Toya raised an inquisitive eyebrow, one of her trademark gestures. "Go ahead." "About what?" Salvador hesitated for a moment, but then overcame his shyness and asked, "Toya, do your boys know about me? I mean, the fact that I'm their real uncle." She shrugged and moved her head to the side. "I don't know, to be honest. Sooner or later, they will find out about you, I suppose. It's only a matter of time. I need to prepare them. I don't want this revelation to distress their young minds. You are practically their father's doppelganger." "I understand," Salvador replied. Salvador didn't rush to leave. He was contemplating whether to confess to Toya now or continue to wait for the right moment, the so-called perfect timing. He didn't want to scare her off. "Good night, my sister-in-law," he said humorously. Toya laughed. "Well, yes, in terms of family hierarchy, you're my sister-in-law, or rather, my brother's wife." "Good night, Salvador," she replied warmly. Toya entered the building, and Salvador sat behind the wheel, saying to himself, "Brother's wife, no, that's not right. Soon she will be my wife." He no longer had any doubts because he could sense her feelings toward him. When mutual attraction begins to bloom between people, there is nothing else like it. Meanwhile, as Toya climbed the stairs, she scolded herself, "Silly, crazy girl. Have you lost your mind? He's Pablo's brother, you should stop." But no one had ever succeeded in stopping the heart. Just 5 days later, Salvador called Investigator Domingo, who had become, by fate's decree, a member of the search team. He invited the whole honest crew to his office and announced exactly what they had been so diligently pursuing and, at the same time, were afraid to hear. In the village, at the family house, lives none other than Lorenza Ray. "Hold on, gentlemen and ladies," Julia exclaimed in amazement. "Lorenza Ray? Mario Ray is a renowned artist. So, does this mean Mario Ray is your great-grandfather? And if her son was named Eusebio, then Eusebio Ray is your father? Well, friends, this is quite something." Julia was astonished, losing her ability to speak. Salvador fell silent, unable to believe his ears. "You're absolutely right, Julia," Domingo confirmed. "These are very famous artists. Mario Rey is buried in a well-known cemetery. But Eusebio Rey and his wife, Aurelia Herrero, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. You know what kind of speculation was going around at that time? They said he went abroad with a clean slate and might have changed his name. They vanished without a trace." "Oh my goodness," Toya breathed. "Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction." "Salvador, why are you so quiet?" Salvador continued to gesture in bewilderment, at a loss for words. "We need to go to the village," Toya declared. "Tomorrow, first thing." "Right," Salvador finally spoke up. He dialed a number on his phone and instructed his secretary. "Eleonora, please book 2 plane tickets to the capital for me, for tomorrow morning if possible, or any available flight during the day." She answered. "What about me?" Julia made a mock tearful face. "Eleonora, not 2, but 3 tickets." 3. "Business class, if possible, but not necessary," she replied. Salvador lifted his chin triumphantly, exuding confidence. The flight was scheduled for the morning, and he needed a bit of rest and composure. They all went home, and the following day, by evening, the trio set out for the village in a taxi. The driver stopped amidst the woods at the beginning of a raised road, which they had to traverse for 500 meters on foot. It was house number 7. When the group approached the building, Toya gasped aloud. Before her stood the very 2-story mansion she had seen in one of her previous dreams. It was an old house, probably built in the 19th century. In its prime, it had been tended to, partially renovated, and modernized, but now it looked neglected, moderately untidy, and abandoned. The house was surrounded by a wrought iron fence. Through it, at the rear of the mansion, they could see part of the garden, where a gravel path led into the depths. On either side of the path, in a checkerboard pattern, stood weathered, moisture-stained antique statues that had not been well maintained for a long time. There were not many of them, and they were spaced at a decent distance from one another. In the foreground, flower beds were overgrown with weeds. And behind the house, in the garden, there should be a lake or a pond, Toya said. "Where do you know that from?" Juliet asked with interest. "This very house I saw in my dream," Toya replied. "Oh my, it's like a mystery," Julia charmed, as if she had stepped into a fairy tale. At the gate, the group noticed a doorbell. Without much thought, Salvador pressed the button 4 times in a row. In a matter of minutes, they saw a man coming out of the mansion, bearing a resemblance to a disgruntled monkey. Perhaps he was the caretaker? He approached the gate but didn't open it, instead grumbling in a deep voice without any greeting. "Who are you?" "We're here to see Lorenza Rey on a very important matter," Salvador replied. "What's matter?" The man persisted. Toya took over the conversation at this point. "This is Lorenza's grandson," she said firmly. "Open the door and let us in, or the police will be here." She had fabricated the police threat on the spot, but there was no need to continue arguing with the man. On the spacious porch, an elderly woman appeared with a cane in her right hand. She took a few steps forward to ensure her voice was heard and commanded, "Rodrigo, let them in." The newcomers heard a soft, elderly voice that, despite its age, had velvety richness and the harmonic beauty of a woman in full bloom of youth and strength. Even in her advanced years, Lorenza retained traces of her former beauty. She wore a well-coiffed wig and a long dress adorned with a pearl necklace. On her limping legs, she had not chosen slippers or sandals, but old-fashioned patent leather shoes with mother-of-pearl accents. The group was led not into the house, but into a gazebo. Lorenza Rey gestured for them to take seats on a round bench while she herself settled in, much like a queen on her throne, maintaining a regal air with her hand resting on the knob of her cane. Toya examined her face, which she had once so carefully concealed from her in the dream, and found more and more similarities with Pablo and Salvador. "So, who are you, and what do you want?" Lorenza asked. It was clear that the old woman had not interacted with society for a long time, as she had sequestered herself in the mansion due to age and illness. Now, with a readiness bubbling up from within, she was prepared to listen to living people who had come to her from the outside world. But these people had prepared themselves in a certain way because they knew who they were facing, the one who had brought suffering into their lives. Toya, for instance, felt a strong aversion toward her. This woman seemed to exude a chilling coldness and something else entirely unpleasant. Salvador stared at her directly and finally spoke boldly. "Lorenza, I am one of the twins, and my mother, Aurelia, decided to distance herself from us based on your guidance. I am your grandson." Lorenza's face immediately changed, contorted, and lost its beauty. She looked at Salvador angrily. "What?" she bellowed, though her roar came out hoarse and feeble rather than thunderous. "My twin brother, your second grandson, perished," Salvador continued, raising his voice. "But as you can see, I am alive, and I have found you." Neither Toya, Salvador, nor Julia knew that Domingo, in contact with the capital, had sent a team of police officers to the village right behind the group of seekers. While the heroes were trying to establish contact with Lorenza, a whole squad of officers was en route to the village. After Salvador's announcement, chaos ensued. The old woman rose menacingly, leaning on the back of the bench, raised her cane high, and shook it, yelling until she grew hoarse. "Get out, imposter! Get out of here, Rodrigo, drive these scoundrels away! Out!" she wheezed. The man, who bore a resemblance to a monkey, rushed at Salvador, and a scuffle broke out. The women initially screamed in surprise and even fear at the sudden brawl, but when they saw Lorenza brandishing her cane at Salvador, they rushed toward her, wrestling her arm to take the weapon away. Salvador subdued the man, applying a painful technique. Julia, not missing a beat, tore the belt from her jeans and handed it to Salvador, who used it to bind the caretaker's hands, leaving him lying on the floor of the gazebo. Lorenza Ray was forcibly seated on the bench, and her cane, which she had used as a weapon, was confiscated. However, Salvador didn't get a chance to ask her anything else. A hostage rescue team had stormed the estate, although there seemed to be no hostages. Quietly and unnoticed by the group of seekers, Domingo had been conducting investigations into the Ray family. He had suspected that Lorenza had ulterior motives for her actions regarding the abandoned twins. And he was right. Lorenza, who had adamantly refused to answer questions, was placed in a psychiatric hospital where she died from a stroke 2 days later. The entire estate and the adjacent garden were thoroughly examined. The findings sent shivers down everyone's spines. Human remains, or bones, were discovered inside 2 concrete statues, cleverly disguised as ancient sculptures. After a forensic examination, it was revealed that Lorenza had buried her son and daughter-in-law in these statues. She had not personally committed the murders, but had instead hired a hitman and a mason and paid them substantial sums to do the gruesome work. Apparently, she had a change of heart when it came to the children and spared their lives. One question remained unanswered. Who was Lorenza's husband and Eusebio's father? Who was the grandfather of Pablo and Salvador? Who was this person, and where was he? As is often the case with mentally disturbed individuals, or rather inhumane ones, the motive behind their horrifying actions was incredibly banal: money. Mario Ray had bequeathed an astronomical inheritance to his daughter Lorenza and her son Eusebio, consisting not only of bank accounts but also of precious jewelry and renowned paintings. Lorenza was unwilling to share any of it with anyone. With the obsession and cruelty of a maniac, this aristocratic lady eliminated those who posed a threat, and her perceived threats were her son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandsons. It was all shockingly simple and horrifying at the same time. One day, Toya called Salvador. "Come over today. I've told the kids about you, and they want to meet you. They're looking forward to seeing you." Toya opened the door, and Salvador Castro stepped inside with a huge bouquet of roses and a massive box of customized cake. Manuel and Celso, who had grown into young teenagers and were beyond the age of childish nicknames, came out into the hallway. However, they didn't mind that their mother still saw them as her little boys. The boys' eyes widened in amazement. They had heard from their mom that Salvador was a spitting image of their dad, Pablo, but they hadn't expected him to be this similar. After a while, they got used to Salvador, realizing that there were many differences between him and their father, just as there were between Manuel and Celso. Salvador, approaching a portrait of Pablo, couldn't take his eyes off it for a long time, tears welling up in his eyes. He felt indescribable emotions that turned his soul inside out, feelings that couldn't be expressed in words. "Hello, little brother. Look at you," he finally said. Then he embraced the boys and repeated, "Well, I finally met you." Today was a celebratory dinner during which their mother and Salvador openly shared their love for each other with the children. 2 months later, a joyous wedding took place, starting at the Civil Registry office where their mother worked as a registrar. Forming a family was a wonderful event, and from then on, everything depended on the people involved. However, the story didn't end there. Toya and Salvador weren't chasing material wealth, they were merely trying to uncover the reasons behind their ancestors' unjust treatment and figure out their true lineage. But as the saying goes, what goes around comes around, and kindness is repaid in kind. In due time, Salvador inherited his great-grandfather Mario Rey's estate by law, along with the family house, because Salvador Castro, essentially Salvador Rey, was the sole direct heir of the family.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.